She was pregnant and vulnerable, but stood tall in court, and made him regret everything. The air in the courtroom was suffocatingly tense. All eyes turned toward the entrance as Madeline walked in, her steps measured, her hand gently resting on the curve of her pregnant belly. At 7 months, she moved slower than usual, but her expression was composed, almost too calm. The murmurs stopped, replaced by the hollow sound of her heels against the marble floor. Seated at the defendant's table was her soon-to-be ex-husband, Gregory, dressed in a tailored navy suit, legs crossed arrogantly, a smug grin plastered on his face as he leaned back and whispered something to his attorney. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the hostility in the room had already taken its seat. Madeline avoided looking at him, not because of fear, but because she didn't want to acknowledge the man who had once vowed to love her forever, now accusing her of betrayal and trying to rob her of everything. Her heart pounded beneath her ribs, not from nerves, but from the cruel irony that the man who had abandoned her in the most fragile state of her life was the one now pretending to be the victim. She sat down slowly, took a breath, and gently placed a hand over her stomach as if to say, "You and I, we're going to get through this." The bailiff called for silence, and the courtroom fell still. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Years earlier, their wedding had been the envy of everyone. It was held in a vineyard surrounded by rolling hills, with white roses laced through the arched altar, and golden lights strung through the trees. Gregory had looked like the picture of a perfect husband, charming, successful, ambitious. He came from a wealthy family, one of those legacies that walked with self-entitlement, and yet he had chosen Madeline, a schoolteacher from modest means, to be his wife. Their love had seemed pure. He would surprise her with handwritten notes, breakfast in bed on weekends, and long drives to nowhere just to talk. She believed she had found her fairy tale, the one every little girl imagines. But fairy tales have shadows, and hers began to creep in barely a year after the wedding. Gregory became colder, more calculating. Where once there had been affection, there was now critique. Her clothes weren't refined enough, her work as a teacher didn't match his social circle, and her modesty became a flaw instead of a virtue. He began spending more time at work, often leaving her alone for dinners and weekends. When she brought up her concerns, he would laugh them off or call her paranoid. And still, she tried to believe it was a phase, just the stress of his expanding business. She kept silent, kept loving, and kept hoping. The first time he humiliated her in public was during a dinner with his colleagues. Madeline had offered her opinion on an education policy being discussed, only for Gregory to cut her off with a laugh, saying, "Let the professionals speak, sweetheart. You teach ABCs, not economics." The room laughed with him, but Madeline's cheeks burned. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it, with deliberate condescension, a look of triumph in his eyes as though silencing her gave him pleasure. After that evening, she found herself withdrawing more and more, her once vibrant spirit dulled by repeated jabs masked as jokes. She would confront him later in private, but he would call her sensitive, overly emotional, or accuse her of trying to ruin his reputation. What made it worse was how others began to mirror his behavior. Friends stopped inviting her to gatherings. Gregory's parents, especially his mother, would make veiled remarks about her not being cut from the right cloth. Her clothes, her opinions, her background, all were slowly chipped away at until even Madeline began to question her worth. But she stayed. She thought love was patience, that loyalty meant enduring storms. She believed that if she just tried harder, he would return to the man she had married. But the Gregory who once held her hand under candlelight dinners was no longer there. He had been replaced by someone who enjoyed watching her shrink. It was raining when Madeline found out she was pregnant. She remembered the flickering light in the bathroom, the sound of thunder outside, and the trembling of her hands as she held the test in disbelief. She had been preparing to leave Gregory, convinced that their marriage had reached a dead end, but this changed everything. The life inside her wasn't a mistake, it felt like hope, like a new beginning. She waited a week before telling him, planning the announcement carefully, hoping it might reignite something human in him. When she finally told him over dinner, his expression didn't soften. He stared at her blankly, then scoffed and said, "That's not possible. I've been careful. Unless, it isn't mine." The room fell silent. She blinked, thinking she had misheard, but he stood and walked away, leaving his food untouched. That night, he didn't come home. Days passed before he returned, and when he did, he brought a stack of divorce papers. "Sign them. You can keep the apartment. I don't want to be dragged into this circus." She didn't cry in front of him. She took the papers, held them with steady hands, and told him to leave. And when the door closed, she collapsed to the floor, not in weakness, but in the quiet grief of realizing she had loved a ghost all along. Gregory made the first move in court. He filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences, but what shocked Madeline was the second document he submitted, an affidavit challenging the paternity of the unborn child. It wasn't enough to leave her, he wanted to strip away the legitimacy of her child, her dignity, and her voice. Rumors began to circulate. His lawyer leaked private details to the media, framing Madeline as unstable, manipulative, and promiscuous. Even her job as a teacher was questioned, with parents whispering that perhaps she shouldn't be around children. It was a character assassination, and Madeline stood at the center, watching her life unravel in the public eye. But something inside her had changed. Maybe it was the child growing within her, or maybe it was the realization that she had nothing left to lose. She decided she would no longer defend herself passively. She hired a new attorney, one who actually listened. She began documenting every message, every interaction, every threat. Gregory believed she would crumble, but instead, he found a woman who stood taller with each passing day. She didn't respond to his taunts or media traps. Instead, she prepared. She knew the courtroom would not only be the place she reclaimed her rights, but also the stage where he would finally face the consequences of every cruel word he ever threw at her. Madeline had always believed in the strength of friendship, but in the wake of the scandal, silence became her closest companion. Colleagues who once shared coffee breaks and casual laughter now avoided her in the halls. Invitations stopped arriving, messages were left unanswered, and even some neighbors who used to greet her with warm smiles averted their eyes. Gregory's narrative had infected their perception of her, and in their eyes, she became a cautionary tale, one too messy to be associated with. It was as though her entire social life had been quietly erased, replaced by judgmental glances and whispers behind closed doors. Even more painful was the betrayal of people she had once considered family. Gregory's mother, who had once kissed her forehead and called her my daughter, now looked at her with contempt, refusing to acknowledge the pregnancy or her presence. "You should just disappear, Madeline. You've done enough damage," she'd whispered at the grocery store one day. Madeline stood there, frozen, clutching a carton of milk, trying to keep her emotions from boiling over. Every day became a battle between maintaining composure and collapsing from the weight of isolation. But she held on, for the life growing inside her and the woman she was becoming. The first day of court was nothing short of a performance orchestrated by Gregory's legal team. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman known for dismantling reputations, painted Madeline as a master manipulator who had seduced Gregory, trapped him into marriage, and now fabricated a pregnancy for financial gain. Photos of her from a charity gala were twisted into evidence of infidelity, and excerpts of text messages were presented out of context to imply instability. Gregory sat with a smug, composed expression, occasionally glancing toward her with a victorious smirk. The courtroom, once a place of justice in her mind, began to feel like a theater built to humiliate her. Her own attorney struggled to cut through the flood of allegations, caught off guard by the volume of false testimonies and polished witnesses Gregory had brought. One of them, a former assistant, claimed to have overheard Madeline confessing the child wasn't Gregory's. The lie hit like a slap, but Madeline kept her gaze forward, her hands tightly clasped around the legal pad in front of her. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Still, inside, the betrayal stung deeper than she expected. It was one thing to be attacked by Gregory, but to be betrayed by people she had once welcomed into her home was another wound entirely. Before the case began, her first attorney had seemed competent. He wore the right suits, had a wall full of certificates, and spoke with the smooth cadence of experience. But Madeline quickly learned that he didn't believe her. He called her emotional and urged her to consider a settlement. "You won't win, not against someone with Gregory's resources," he said, sliding a document across the desk with calculated indifference. It wasn't just the suggestion of compromise that hurt, it was the underlying belief that she didn't deserve justice, that she should accept humiliation quietly and move on. That meeting was the turning point. She thanked him, walked out of his office, and never returned. It took weeks to find someone who didn't look at her with doubt in their eyes. But when she met Celeste Harris, a young but fearless family attorney with a reputation for defending women in complex custody battles, something clicked. Celeste didn't ask if she was telling the truth, she listened, nodded, and said, "They don't know who they're up against." For the first time in months, Madeline felt seen. With Celeste by her side, the tides didn't shift yet, but the wind finally began to stir. It was during the third court session that Madeline noticed him, sitting alone in the back row, quiet, observing. The man didn't speak to anyone, nor did he react to the proceedings. He watched her closely, not with judgment or pity, but with intensity. At first, she thought he was just another journalist, drawn by the scandal of a high society divorce. But there was something different about him. He wasn't taking notes or checking his phone. He just listened. When their eyes met briefly, he offered the slightest nod, almost as if reassuring her. It unsettled her at first, but then, it gave her a strange sense of calm. Later that day, as she left the courthouse with Celeste, she noticed him again, leaning casually near the exit. He didn't approach, just stood silently as if waiting for something, or someone. Celeste noticed her glance and whispered, "Do you know him?" Madeline shook her head. "No. But I think he knows Gregory." Something about the way he watched the proceedings suggested he was gathering more than curiosity, he was collecting truth. She didn't know it then, but that stranger was about to become a key piece in the puzzle Gregory thought he had complete control over. 2 days after the courtroom session, Madeline received a manila envelope at her apartment with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message, "He's hiding more than you know. Look into Vanguard Holdings and the name Colin Blake." No context, no signature. Just those words. Her heart raced as she showed the note to Celeste, who immediately went to work. "Vanguard Holdings is Gregory's company," she muttered, opening her laptop. "But who's Colin Blake?" Hours of searching led them to discover a shadow account under Gregory's name, a hidden financial reservoir funneling money through offshore accounts using Blake's name as a shield. The revelation sent shockwaves through Madeline. While Gregory publicly argued that she was after his wealth, he was secretly transferring millions into untraceable investments. This wasn't just a petty divorce, this was fraud. "This changes everything," Celeste said, printing out documentation. We bring this to court, and suddenly it's not about whether the child is his, it's about his credibility, his character. Madeline stared at the folder in front of her. The humiliation she had endured was no longer just a story of abandonment, it was part of a deeper betrayal. And she wasn't going to let him get away with it. Madeline watched as Gregory entered the courtroom with his usual confidence, but now she noticed something different in his demeanor. There was a subtle stiffness in his movements, a hesitation in his smile. He avoided eye contact more than usual, as if sensing that control was slipping from his fingers. Celeste, armed with the discovery of the hidden assets, maintained her composure but radiated a quiet intensity. Madeline could feel the shift happening, small, almost imperceptible cracks forming in the armor Gregory had built around his lies. The man who once towered over her with arrogance now looked slightly unsure. The judge hadn't yet seen the new documents, but Celeste had filed them as a formal request for a financial audit. Gregory's lawyer tried to block the motion, citing irrelevance to the paternity and custody debate, but the judge raised an eyebrow and said, "If either party is misleading this court about their financial holdings, I find that highly relevant." For the first time, Gregory's smirk faltered. He leaned in to whisper to his attorney, his lips tight, his jaw clenching. From where she sat, Madeline could feel the momentum subtly turning. He had made the mistake of thinking she was fragile. But this wasn't the same woman he married and left. In a dramatic move, Gregory demanded a DNA test to clear his name, as he phrased it to the media. Cameras flashed as he left the courthouse that day, with reporters echoing his accusation. Gregory claims child might not be his. It was the humiliation Madeline feared the most, her unborn child's very identity questioned publicly, as though it were some kind of scandalous guessing game. She didn't flinch on camera, though. When asked for comment, she simply said, "Truth doesn't need defending. It reveals itself in time." Her poise caught some reporters off guard, but inside, her hands trembled. Privately, she agreed to the test, not because she had any doubt, but because she refused to give Gregory the satisfaction of control. The process was cold, clinical. A nurse swabbed her mouth while she sat in silence, feeling the baby stir within her. Gregory didn't even look at her during his appointment, he was too busy ensuring the cameras caught his serious expression. The test results would take days to return, but Madeline didn't need a piece of paper to confirm what she already knew. What she needed was justice, not just for herself, but for the child being dragged through a war before ever being born. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Madeline received a message from a name she hadn't seen in years, Samantha Doyle. Once her closest friend during the early days of marriage, Samantha had disappeared from her life shortly after Gregory's rise in business. "Can we talk? I have something to tell you," the message read. Reluctantly, she agreed to meet. When Samantha arrived at the cafe, she looked pale, nervous, her eyes darting to every corner of the room before sitting down. "I should have said something earlier," she whispered. "But I was scared of what he might do to me too." What Samantha revealed unraveled everything. Gregory had manipulated not only Madeline but others around him. He had bribed a financial auditor during a previous business merger and used Samantha's husband, a low-level accountant, to sign off on falsified statements. When her husband grew uncomfortable, Gregory made sure he was discredited and fired. "He doesn't just lie," Samantha said. "He destroys anyone who won't play along." She handed over a flash drive containing years of emails, documents, and internal memos, evidence of the very fraud Madeline suspected. It was more than they'd hoped for. And it came from someone who finally found the courage to make things right. Celeste worked overnight reviewing every file Samantha had provided. By morning, her eyes were bloodshot, but her expression was sharper than ever. "This is enough to bury him," she said. The emails detailed Gregory's deliberate efforts to hide income, manipulate investors, and even forge board approvals on major decisions. All of it pointed to a man who didn't just want to win a divorce, he wanted to erase any version of Madeline that could stand in his way. What had started as a custody case had now grown into a web of corporate deceit with criminal implications. They filed the new evidence with the court under seal. The moment Gregory received notification, his reaction was immediate. His lawyer filed a motion to delay proceedings, citing health reasons. But it was obvious, he was scrambling. The courtroom was no longer just about a baby's paternity or a woman's dignity. It had become a battlefield of truth versus manipulation, and every thread Gregory had tried to weave was now unraveling. The judge, clearly sensing something bigger at play, ordered an emergency review of Gregory's business records. And for the first time, Madeline watched as the man who once called her useless found himself exposed and cornered. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread that the once glorious Gregory Sloan was now being investigated for financial fraud in the middle of his own divorce. Reporters filled every bench, and even some employees from his company had shown up, eager to see how the man they both admired and feared would handle the storm. Madeline walked in quietly, wearing a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back. She looked calm, almost serene, though her hands rested protectively over her pregnant belly. Gregory entered shortly after, but gone was the arrogance. His eyes were hollow, his steps heavy, as though each footfall echoed the collapse of his carefully crafted image. Celeste addressed the court with precision. "Your Honor, this is no longer just a matter of family law. This is a matter of truth, of accountability, and of the abuse of both legal and financial systems." She presented the emails, the financial transfers, and the forged documents. Gregory's lawyer tried to object, but the judge silenced her. "Let her finish." Madeline didn't need to speak that day. Her silence spoke louder than any testimony. She simply watched as Gregory fidgeted in his chair, sweat forming along his collar. The courtroom, once a place of shame for her, had become the place where truth reclaimed its voice, and justice began to speak. Gregory had always believed he could talk his way out of anything. He leaned on charm, theatrics, and the assumption that people wouldn't look too deeply. But when he took the stand under oath, the courtroom saw a different side of him, a man stumbling through contradictions. Celeste approached the podium with poise and precision, each question slicing through his narrative. "You stated under oath that you ceased contact with Colin Blake 3 years ago, correct?" Gregory nodded. "Then how do you explain this email exchange dated last December, referencing offshore transfers?" His face paled, and he stammered. The room was silent, but the tension was deafening. The judge leaned forward slightly, noting each inconsistency. Celeste continued with quiet ferocity, exposing Gregory's tangled web of lies. She moved from financial records to personal inconsistencies, discrepancies in travel logs, altered documents, even his own timeline of events surrounding the divorce. Gregory's lawyer tried to object, but was overruled again and again. By the time Celeste concluded, Gregory looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. The mask had fallen. The courtroom wasn't laughing at Madeline anymore, they were watching Gregory unravel. It was a rainy afternoon when the DNA test results were delivered to the courthouse. The courtroom was half-filled, but buzzing with quiet anticipation. Gregory sat with forced calm, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He had built an entire argument around the idea that the child wasn't his, used it as both weapon and shield. Madeline sat just a few feet away, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. The clerk handed the sealed envelope to the judge, who opened it slowly and read in silence before lifting his gaze. The results show with 99.9% certainty that Mr. Gregory Sloan is the biological father of the unborn child. Gasps rippled across the room, followed by a hollow silence. Gregory's mouth fell slightly open, his lawyer whispered something urgently in his ear, but he didn't respond. He had lost the only thread left holding his narrative together. Madeline didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her eyes remained forward, fixed on nothing, filled with the quiet peace of vindication. It wasn't just about proving her child's identity, it was about reclaiming her own. The lie he built had collapsed in one sentence. And the courtroom knew it. The next day brought a new shock. Celeste requested an emergency hearing, submitting evidence that the first set of test results, those previously hinted at by Gregory's lawyer, had been fabricated. A forensic technician, acting under pressure from a third party, had attempted to swap samples and delay the results. Surveillance footage confirmed it, and text messages between Gregory's associate and the technician sealed the case. This was not just an attack on my client's character, Celeste told the court. It was a calculated attempt to manipulate the legal process. The judge's expression turned stone cold. We are now dealing with not only perjury but criminal conspiracy, he said, directing his words to Gregory, who sat frozen in his chair. His face was a mixture of disbelief and fear, no longer able to maintain the performance. A child's future was weaponized to serve your ego, the judge added, shaking his head. A court-martial was instructed to begin a formal investigation into the tampering. What was once a simple custody hearing had now become a complex legal storm. And Gregory, for the first time, looked afraid. Just when it seemed the revelations had peaked, a new witness stepped forward. Her name was Vanessa Cole, Gregory's former personal assistant. She had worked closely with him for over 5 years and had disappeared shortly after the divorce process began. Now, she stood before the court, calm but firm. I have documentation, she said. I kept records of every meeting, every financial instruction, and every threat he made to bury Madeline if she didn't disappear quietly. She held up a worn leather folder, filled with receipts, emails, and voice recordings. The judge allowed the evidence, and as Vanessa's voice played through the speakers, Gregory cursing, ordering account movements, mocking Madeline's pregnancy, the courtroom listened in stunned silence. It was the most honest portrait of who he truly was, a man obsessed with control and willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Gregory shrank further in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. Madeline, for her part, closed her eyes as the words echoed through the courtroom, not out of shame, but in solemn recognition of how far she had come from the woman who once thought his love was enough. The next morning, Gregory's downfall made headlines. News outlets picked up the story of the court case gone wrong, prominent CEO faked paternity test in divorce scandal. The public devoured every detail, the hidden accounts, the tampered tests, the assistant's testimony. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as Gregory tried to leave through the back entrance with his lawyer shielding him from questions. But there was no escape. His company's board held an emergency meeting. Sponsors pulled out. Stocks plummeted overnight. Meanwhile, Madeline's name was now spoken with a different tone. No longer the target of ridicule, she became a symbol of quiet strength. Interviews were requested, but she declined them all. Her silence wasn't for fear, it was for peace. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. The truth was out. Gregory had tried to break her through lies, public humiliation, and power. But instead of silencing her, he had exposed himself. And now, the world was watching him fall. The fallout from the courtroom revelations reached far beyond the courthouse. Gregory's company, once praised for its aggressive market dominance, found itself the target of relentless public scrutiny. Clients terminated contracts, investors demanded transparency, and board members began to distance themselves publicly. Overnight, his image as a visionary CEO collapsed into one of scandal and disgrace. The man who once controlled boardrooms with unwavering confidence now had his authority stripped. His office was locked by internal security, and a third-party audit was ordered. Employees whispered behind his back, sharing news articles and courtroom clips, stunned by the man they once admired. Meanwhile, Madeline received a quiet message from an employee she had never met: "We're sorry. We believed him too." It was small, simple, but profoundly validating. Gregory had built a world on status, control, and reputation, but none of that could survive exposure to truth. And now, he wasn't just facing the loss of a marriage. He was facing professional exile. She watched the headlines not with glee, but with solemn reflection. This wasn't vengeance, it was consequence. Madeline hadn't seen the man from the courtroom gallery again, but one evening, Celeste returned from a meeting with news. "He's a forensic financial consultant. Former IRS. His name is Alan Rayner," she said. "And he's the one who tipped us off anonymously." Alan had been investigating Gregory on behalf of a private firm after inconsistencies were discovered in tax filings. When he saw Madeline's name in the civil court docket, he recognized an opportunity to connect the dots. He hadn't stepped forward publicly to protect the integrity of the ongoing investigations, but his work behind the scenes had been pivotal. Celeste handed Madeline a folder labeled "Confidential." Inside were documents Alan had gathered, some of them tracing back years, showing just how long Gregory's deception had been in motion. "You weren't just a casualty of a bad divorce," Celeste said. "You were a target in a system Gregory built to protect himself." Madeline held the folder in silence, overwhelmed not only by the evidence but by the idea that someone, even silently, had believed in her enough to help. In a world that had tried to erase her voice, one quiet act of support had echoed louder than all the accusations. The judge ordered a comprehensive financial audit of Gregory's assets. What followed was a storm of revelations: multiple shell companies, real estate purchased under aliases, and funds shifted to offshore accounts. What was initially believed to be a simple divorce case had unraveled into potential criminal activity on a national level. Federal authorities were alerted. Gregory, once smug and untouchable, now faced serious legal consequences far beyond custody battles. His lawyer, overwhelmed by the damage, requested to withdraw from representation. Madeline sat in court as the forensic accountants laid out the findings, document after document, the figures painting a portrait of greed, manipulation, and premeditated deceit. She thought of all the nights she spent doubting herself, wondering what she had done wrong to deserve such cruelty. Now she saw it clearly: it was never about her flaws. It was about his corruption. And the child she carried would never grow up under the illusion that this man represented strength or success. That legacy would end here, with the truth laid bare. As Gregory's legal walls crumbled, the court reconvened for a final hearing on the matter of divorce settlement and child custody. His once demanding posture was now hollow. He appeared gaunt, defeated. The judge read from a prepared statement, condemning his actions in no uncertain terms. "This court finds that Mr. Sloan engaged in deliberate acts of fraud, deception, and character defamation," the judge said. "In light of this, full physical and legal custody of the child shall be granted to the mother, Ms. Madeline Grant." There was no applause, no cheers, just the quiet stillness of a gavel hitting wood, final and irreversible. Gregory looked toward Madeline, as if searching for sympathy, but she didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stood slowly, steady and silent, holding her belly with one hand and her dignity with the other. Outside, reporters called her name, but she walked past them without a word. This wasn't a victory march. It was a closing chapter. And it belonged to her. The financial division of assets followed swiftly. With the fraud exposed and Gregory's credibility destroyed, the court ruled that Madeline was entitled to more than just equitable distribution. She was awarded full ownership of their primary residence, immediate access to frozen accounts for prenatal care, and a significant portion of the hidden funds recovered through the audit. Gregory, in turn, faced personal fines, back taxes, and ongoing investigations that would drain whatever remained of his fortune. Yet, Madeline didn't smile at the outcome. The material gains meant little in comparison to the emotional closure she had finally received. As she signed the final documents, her fingers hesitated for just a moment, not from doubt, but from the weight of everything that led her to this point. The woman who once apologized for taking up space had now been heard, not through anger or revenge, but through quiet, unshakable truth. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. It was a cold morning in early December when Madeline went into labor. The winter sun peeked through the clouds as she was rushed to the hospital, her breathing steady despite the pain. Celeste arrived not long after, holding her hand through each contraction, never leaving her side. Hours passed like minutes, and then, silence, followed by the powerful, unmistakable cry of new life. A girl. She was healthy, perfect, and impossibly small in Madeline's arms. Tears streamed down Madeline's face, not from exhaustion, but from overwhelming love. For the first time, the weight she had carried, emotionally, physically, legally, felt lifted. She named her daughter Eliana, meaning God has answered. Nurses came and went, but Madeline barely noticed them. Her focus was only on the tiny human breathing softly against her chest. She whispered promises into the newborn's ear, vows of protection, of truth, of never allowing the shadows of the past to touch her future. As she looked down at her daughter, she realized this wasn't just the end of a battle, it was the beginning of everything. And in that sterile hospital room, filled with warmth and light, Madeline finally allowed herself to smile without fear. Weeks after Eliana's birth, a letter arrived, handwritten, stamped from a correctional facility. It was from Gregory. The return address alone made her hand tremble slightly, but she didn't hesitate to open it. Inside, the tone was different. No threats, no arrogance. Just a scrawled apology. I don't expect forgiveness, he wrote, but I see now what I became. I ruined everything I ever touched. Including you. He spoke of his regrets, his shame, and ended with a final line. If she ever asks about me, tell her I was a man who lost everything because he didn't know what love was. Madeline read it once, then again. It didn't bring peace, nor anger, just quiet reflection. She folded the letter, placed it in an old box, and tucked it away. Eliana deserved to know the truth one day, but she didn't need to carry her father's mistakes. That burden had already been burned in the fire of justice. The past had tried to define her, but it no longer held power. Gregory's words might have come from guilt, but they arrived too late to rewrite the damage. Madeline had already closed that door, and locked it behind her. Spring arrived slowly, painting the world in soft greens and early blossoms. Madeline stood at the entrance of a modest new office suite, her name printed on the door beneath the words family advocacy and legal support. After everything she had endured, she decided to return to school, finishing her law degree with night classes and fierce determination. Now, she used her knowledge not for revenge, but for restoration. Her firm focused on supporting women like her, those who had been silenced, discarded, and made to believe their stories weren't worth telling. Clients came in scared, broken, uncertain. But Madeline knew how to meet their pain with strength. She shared what she could, not all the details, but enough to show that healing was possible. Eliana, now crawling and full of life, often stayed in the back office with Celeste, who had become more than a lawyer. She was family. They had turned their survival into a foundation. The world didn't go easy on women like them. So, they built a place where resilience didn't just survive, it thrived. Months later, Madeline received an invitation from a prominent legal podcast known for telling real stories behind courtroom dramas. At first, she hesitated. Her story was already behind her, or so she thought. But something inside her said it was time. She agreed to the interview, setting boundaries on what could be discussed, making sure the focus would be on resilience and change, not scandal. When the day came, she sat before the microphone with grace, her voice calm and clear. She spoke not of the pain, but of the strength it carved out of her. She described the fear of losing everything, and the quiet power of choosing to stand. She told the host, "I was broken, yes. But I wasn't destroyed." And I think the world needs to see what happens when women stop apologizing for surviving. When the episode aired, it struck a chord across the country. Messages poured in from listeners who saw themselves in her voice. And though she never sought fame, her story became a lifeline for others. Finally, her truth had become more than a defense. It had become a light. Years later, Madeline stepped into another courtroom, but this time, not as the accused, not as the abandoned wife or the humiliated defendant. She walked in wearing a navy blazer, a firm look in her eyes, with Eliana, now a vibrant 6-year-old, waiting with Celeste in the hallway. She was there to represent a client, a woman whose story echoed her own. As she stood to speak, her voice didn't waver. The courtroom that once watched her fall now witnessed her rise. She spoke with conviction, clarity, and compassion. The opposing counsel tried to diminish her client, but Madeline stood firm, every word sharp and unwavering. The judge nodded thoughtfully, clearly moved. And as she gathered her notes after the session, she paused for a moment, looking around the room. The same wooden benches. The same silence. But the woman standing there now was unrecognizable from the one who had once cried silently in the shadows. She adjusted her bag, walked out with confidence, and as the door closed behind her, the chapter finally felt complete.